The sound of a shotgun blast ripped through the crisp morning air, sending Elizabeth Reed Blackwell diving behind an overturned wagon as dust and splinters exploded around her. She was a long way from Boston now, and as bullets whistled overhead, she wondered if she'd live to see another sunrise in this God-forsaken territory. The year was 1876, and the Dakota Territory had shown her nothing but hardship since the moment she'd arrived 6 months ago. "Get down." A gruff voice commanded as a man in a worn leather vest slid beside her, his revolver already drawn. "Those bandits aren't taking prisoners today, miss." Elizabeth clutched her satchel tightly to her chest, her knuckles white. "I need to reach Fargo," she gasped. "My brother, you won't reach anywhere if you're dead," the stranger replied, his ice-blue eyes scanning the ridge where puffs of gun smoke betrayed the bandits' positions. "Name's Kyle Grayson. Most folks call me Gray, and you've picked a mighty inconvenient time to travel, miss." "Blackwell." "Elizabeth Reed Blackwell," she replied, flinching as another bullet splintered the wagon wheel above them. "And I didn't exactly choose this ambush, Mr. Grayson." A hint of a smile crossed his weathered face. "Fair enough. When I give the signal, run for those rocks." He nodded toward a boulder formation 20 yards away. "Don't stop, don't look back, understood?" Elizabeth nodded, gathering her skirts, when Gray suddenly fired 3 rapid shots and shouted, "Now!" She ran as if the devil himself were at her heels. She didn't look back, not even when she heard the thunder of hooves and more gunfire. Only when she reached the safety of the rocks did she turn to see Gray riding toward her on a magnificent chestnut stallion, leading a second horse by the reins. "Your transportation, Miss Blackwell," he said, tossing her the reins to a dappled mare. "Unless you prefer walking to Fargo with those bandits on our trail." Elizabeth hesitated only a moment before mounting the horse. As they rode hard across the plains, she had no way of knowing that this chance encounter would forever change the course of her life, or that, within 3 days, she would be fighting for her life in treacherous quicksand along the riverbank, with only this mysterious cowboy standing between her and certain death. 3 days later, Elizabeth stood at the edge of the mighty Missouri River, watching the late afternoon sun cast golden light across the water. They had traveled hard, stopping only when necessary, always looking over their shoulders for signs of the bandits. Gray had been mostly silent, answering her questions with brief responses, sharing little about himself beyond that he worked as a ranch hand and occasional bounty hunter. "We should reach Fargo by tomorrow afternoon," he said, approaching from where he'd been tending the horses. "The river's running high this spring. We'll follow it north for a few miles, then cut east toward town." Elizabeth nodded, relieved that their journey was nearly over. The urgency of reaching her brother Samuel hadn't diminished. His last letter had been desperate, warning of threats against his life after he'd uncovered corruption in Fargo's land office. But these days with Gray had been unexpectedly affecting. Beneath his gruff exterior, she'd glimpsed moments of kindness. The way he always gave her the better portion of their meals, how he'd lent her his coat when the night winds grew cold. "Thank you for escorting me," she said, her voice softer than she'd intended. "I know it wasn't your plan to play hero to a stranded Easterner." Gray shrugged, his eyes on the horizon. "Wasn't much of a plan to begin with, just heading north for work." After a pause, he added, "Your brother, is he in some kind of trouble?" Elizabeth hesitated. "Samuel is. Principled to a fault. He moved west 2 years ago to work in the land office. His letters described irregularities in land claims, wealthy speculators bribing officials to seize homesteaders' properties. His last letter said he had proof, but feared for his safety." Gray's expression darkened. "Land fraud's common out here. Powerful men don't take kindly to being exposed." He studied her face. "You came all this way alone. That's either very brave or very foolish." "Perhaps both," Elizabeth admitted, "but he's the only family I have left." As they prepared to continue their journey, Elizabeth noticed dark clouds gathering in the distance. The wind carried the scent of rain, and the air felt heavy with approaching storm energy. Gray looked concerned as he secured their packs. "Weather's turning," he observed. "We should find shelter before nightfall." They rode along the riverbank, the water swollen from spring thaws. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous, muddy in some places, deceptively dry in others. Elizabeth noticed areas where the ground seemed to ripple slightly, the vegetation sparse. "Stay on the path," Gray warned. "This time of year, the riverbank's treacherous. Quicksand pockets form where you least expect them." Elizabeth nodded, concentrating on following his trail precisely. But as they rounded a bend, a flash of lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Her mare reared in terror, nearly throwing her. Elizabeth clung desperately to the reins, trying to control the panicked animal. "Easy, easy, girl." She called, but the horse bolted, veering off the safe path and toward the riverbank. "Elizabeth, stop!" Gray shouted, spurring his horse after her. She pulled hard on the reins, but too late the mare stepped onto what looked like solid ground but immediately began to sink. The horse whinnied in terror, struggling desperately as its legs disappeared into the earth. Elizabeth kicked free of the stirrups just as the horse sank to its belly, and she tumbled sideways onto what she thought was solid ground. For one heartbeat, she felt relief, then horror as the earth beneath her began to give way. Quicksand, just as Gray had warned. She felt herself sinking, the wet sand already past her ankles, then her calves. "Don't struggle," Gray called, dismounting his horse a safe distance away. "The more you fight, the faster you'll sink." Elizabeth tried to remain calm, but panic clawed at her throat as the quicksand reached her knees. "Gray," she cried, extending her arms toward him. He moved carefully to firmer ground at the edge of the quicksand pit, uncoiling the lasso from his saddle. "Keep your arms out, spread your weight." His voice was commanding but steady, betraying none of the fear she saw in his eyes. The rain began to fall in heavy drops as Gray measured the distance, swinging the rope in practiced circles above his head. Elizabeth was now sunk to mid-thigh, her heavy skirts dragging her down faster. "When I throw this, grab it with both hands and hold tight," he instructed. "Don't pull, let me do that. Just keep your body as flat as possible." Elizabeth nodded, struggling to control her breathing. Gray threw the rope with perfect precision, and she caught it firmly with both hands, wrapping it around her wrists as he'd taught her during their journey. "Good girl," he called. "Now, don't struggle. Let me pull you out slowly." Gray braced himself and began to pull, his powerful shoulders straining against the rope. The quicksand reluctantly released its grip inch by excruciating inch. Rain poured down around them, making the rescue even more difficult as Gray's boots slipped in the mud. Finally, Elizabeth felt herself being dragged free. With one final mighty heave, Gray pulled her clear of the quicksand and into his arms, both of them falling backward onto solid ground. They lay there for a moment, Elizabeth trembling with shock and relief, Gray's strong arms still wrapped protectively around her. "I've got you," he murmured against her rain-soaked hair. "You're safe now." Elizabeth looked up into his face, rain streaming down his features, and saw something there beyond concern, something that made her breath catch. For the first time since their meeting, his guard was completely down, and the raw emotion in his eyes made her heart race faster than the quicksand had. "Thank you," she whispered, suddenly aware of how closely they were pressed together, of the strength in the arms that had saved her life. Gray seemed to realize their position at the same moment. He helped her to her feet, but didn't immediately let go of her arms, as if afraid she might still be in danger. "My horse," Elizabeth said, suddenly remembering. They both turned to see the mare had managed to struggle free from the shallower edge of the quicksand pit and stood trembling but alive on firm ground. "She found her way out," Gray said with relief. "Smart animal." He looked back at Elizabeth, his eyes moving over her mud-covered form. "Are you hurt?" Elizabeth shook her head, though her legs felt weak and every muscle ached. "Nothing serious, thanks to you." The storm was intensifying. Thunder rolled overhead as lightning illuminated the darkening landscape. "We need shelter," Gray said, scanning the area. "There's an old trapper's cabin about a half-mile upriver." "Can you ride?" Elizabeth nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure her shaking legs would cooperate. Gray helped her onto his horse and led both animals away from the treacherous riverbank, one hand remaining on Elizabeth's leg as if to reassure himself she wouldn't fall. The trapper's cabin was small but sound, with a stone fireplace and solid roof. Gray quickly had a fire blazing, filling the single room with warmth and light. Elizabeth stood dripping near the doorway, suddenly self-conscious of her mud-caked appearance. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," Gray said matter-of-factly, rummaging through his saddlebags. He pulled out a clean shirt and pair of trousers. "These will be too big, but they're dry." Elizabeth felt a blush creep up her neck despite the chill. I couldn't possibly, you'll catch your death otherwise," he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. He handed her the clothes and turned his back. "I'll tend to the horses, take your time." After he left, Elizabeth quickly changed out of her ruined dress. Gray's clothes smelled of leather and pine, and despite their size, felt wonderfully warm and dry. She wrung out her hair as best she could and hung her sodden garments near the fire to dry. When Gray returned, his eyes widened momentarily at the sight of her in his clothes, her long auburn hair loose around her shoulders. Something flickered in his expression before he quickly looked away. "Storms set in for the night," he reported, removing his drenched coat. "We'll have to wait till morning." They shared a simple meal of jerky and biscuits from his provisions. As the storm raged outside, Elizabeth found herself watching Gray in the firelight. His features were strong, handsome in a rugged way, with lines at the corners of his eyes that hinted at a smile rarely shown. "You're staring, Miss Blackwell," he said without looking up from the knife he was cleaning. Elizabeth didn't look away. "You saved my life today," he shrugged. "Anyone would have done the same." "No, they wouldn't." She moved closer to the fire, closer to him. "Why did you help me? Back at the ambush, you could have ridden past. You didn't know me." Gray was silent for a long moment, his hands stilling on the knife. Finally, he said, "My father taught me never to ride past someone in trouble." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Besides, something told me you were worth saving." The intensity in his blue eyes made Elizabeth's heart skip. She realized with sudden clarity that in the span of a few days, this man had come to matter to her in ways she couldn't fully understand. "Tell me about Boston," Gray said, breaking the moment. "What did you leave behind?" Elizabeth smiled sadly. "Not much. Our parents died in a fever epidemic 3 years ago. I was teaching at a ladies' academy. It was respectable, safe, and utterly unlike you," Gray observed. Elizabeth looked up, surprised. "What makes you say that?" "A woman who travels alone across half the country to help her brother isn't made for safe and respectable." There was admiration in his voice. "You've got grit." Elizabeth Reed Blackwell, coming from him, it felt like the highest compliment. "And what about you? What's your story, Kyle Grayson?" Gray's expression closed slightly. "Not much to tell. Born in Kentucky, fought for the Union, came west after the war like thousands of others." "That's not a story, that's a telegram," Elizabeth chided gently. "What brought you to Dakota Territory?" He stared into the fire. "Running at first." "From memories, from ghosts," he glanced at her. "But a man can't outrun his past forever." "What happened?" she asked softly. Gray was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "I had a wife, Sarah, and a son. They died of cholera while I was away fighting." His voice was flat, as if reciting facts that belonged to someone else. "I came home to 2 graves and a burned-out farm." Elizabeth's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry," he nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without looking at her. "It was a lifetime ago." "Is that why you keep everyone at a distance? Why you're always moving?" Gray's eyes snapped to hers, surprised by her directness. "You don't mince words, do you?" "Life's too short for mincing," she replied, "especially out here." A reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "Fair enough." He sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "Yes, I suppose that's part of it. Easier not to get attached. And is it easier?" Elizabeth asked. Their eyes met across the fire and something unspoken passed between them. "Not always," he admitted quietly. The storm continued through the night, rain lashing against the cabin walls. Elizabeth eventually drifted to sleep on a bedroll near the fire, while Gray kept watch from a chair by the door. When she woke in the early morning hours, she found his coat draped over her for extra warmth. He was still in the chair, head tilted back against the wall, finally sleeping in the gray light of dawn. Elizabeth studied him openly. The hard lines of his face were softer in sleep, years seeming to fall away. She wondered what he had been like before loss had hardened him, before he'd built walls around his heart. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving a washed, clean world behind. Elizabeth slipped quietly from beneath the coat and stepped outside. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, the river glittering in the distance. Birds called from the trees, and for the first time since leaving Boston, Elizabeth felt a sense of belonging in this wild place. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Gray's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, watching her. "Yes," she agreed. "I never understood the appeal of the West until now." He came to stand beside her, surveying the landscape. "It gets in your blood, the freedom of it." "Is that what you found out here? Freedom?" Gray considered her question seriously. "Maybe, or maybe just room to breathe." He glanced at her. "Your brother chose it too, must run in the family." Elizabeth smiled. "Samuel was always the adventurous one. I was the sensible sister until now. And now." She looked out at the vast landscape, feeling changed in ways she couldn't articulate. "Now I'm not sure who I am anymore." Gray's hand briefly touched her shoulder. "You're the woman who crossed a continent alone to help her brother. I'd say that's someone worth being." Their eyes met, and Elizabeth felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Before she could respond, Gray turned back toward the cabin. "We should get moving if we want to reach Fargo today," he said, his voice returning to its usual businesslike tone. But something had shifted between them, something Elizabeth couldn't ignore. As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth changed back into her now dry dress, though it was still stained with mud. Gray packed efficiently, leaving the cabin as they had found it. When Elizabeth tried to return his clothes, he shook his head. "Keep them," he said. "You never know when you might need a disguise." She smiled, folding the garments carefully into her saddlebag. "Are you suggesting I might make a habit of dressing as a man, Mr. Grayson?" A hint of a smile crossed his face. "I'm suggesting you're unpredictable, Miss Blackwell, and that's not a bad thing." They rode at a steady pace through the morning, the terrain gradually changing as they moved away from the river and toward more settled lands. By midday, they began to see farms and homesteads in the distance. "Fargo's just beyond that rise," Gray said, pointing ahead. "Your brother's office is in town," Elizabeth nodded, feeling a mixture of anticipation and an unexpected reluctance. Their journey was ending, and soon they would part ways. The thought left her with an emptiness she hadn't anticipated. "Gray," she began, not sure what she wanted to say, only that she needed to say something before they reached town. He looked at her, waiting. "I thank you. Not just for saving me yesterday, but for everything." The words felt inadequate. Gray studied her for a long moment. "You're welcome, Elizabeth," he said simply, but his eyes conveyed more than his words. They crested the rise, and Fargo appeared before them, a bustling frontier town with wooden buildings lining a main street, horses hitched to posts, and people going about their business. After days in the wilderness, the sight of civilization was almost jarring. "The land office will be near the center of town," Gray said as they rode down the slope. "We should find your brother there." The streets of Fargo were muddy from the recent rain, but busy with activity. Wagons rolled past, merchants called out their wares, and the smell of cooking food filled the air. Elizabeth felt eyes on her as they rode. A mud-stained woman accompanied by a hard-looking cowboy was bound to draw attention. They reached the land office, a substantial building with a painted sign. Gray helped Elizabeth dismount, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. As she straightened her dress and attempted to smooth her travel-worn appearance, the office door opened and a thin man in spectacles emerged. "Can I help you, madam?" he asked, eyeing her disheveled state with suspicion. "I'm looking for Samuel Blackwell," Elizabeth said. "I'm his sister." The man's expression changed immediately to one of discomfort. "Miss Blackwell, he glanced nervously up and down the street. "Perhaps you'd better come inside." A cold dread settled in Elizabeth's stomach. Gray must have sensed it too, because his hand moved to rest on her lower back, a silent gesture of support, Inside the office, the man introduced himself as Jeremiah Porter, a clerk at the land office. "I'm afraid I have difficult news," he said, removing his spectacles. "Your brother Samuel was found dead 3 days ago, shot in what the sheriff called a robbery gone wrong." The world seemed to tilt beneath Elizabeth's feet. She felt Gray's hand steady her, heard him asking questions, but the words were muffled by the roaring in her ears. Samuel dead. Her journey, her hope, all for nothing. "Where is he buried?" she finally managed to ask. "Cemetery at the edge of town," Porter replied. "I'm terribly sorry, Miss Blackwell. Your brother was a good man." "A good man who uncovered corruption," Elizabeth said sharply. "Was that investigated?" Porter paled. "Miss Blackwell, I don't know what you're implying." "She's implying her brother was murdered," Gray cut in, his voice cold. "And not by random thieves." Porter dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief. "These are serious accusations." The sheriff concluded. "I'd like to speak with this sheriff," Gray interrupted. "And I'd like to see Samuel's personal effects." Porter hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "His belongings are at the hotel where he was staying. Rooms been paid through the end of the month. Sheriff Caldwell has his office down the street." He wrote something on a piece of paper. "This will get you access to the room." Outside, Elizabeth stood motionless in the street, struggling to process her loss. Gray remained beside her, a solid presence in a world suddenly gone unstable. "I'm too late," she whispered. Gray's hand touched her arm. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth." She looked up at him, grief hardening into resolve. "I want to know what happened to him. Really happened." Gray studied her face, then nodded. "Then that's what we'll find out." He glanced toward the hotel. "Let's start with his room." Samuel's hotel room was modest but neat. His belongings were few clothes in the dresser, books on the nightstand, papers on the desk. Elizabeth moved through the space in a daze, touching his things, feeling the lingering presence of her brother. "He was always organized," she said softly, running her fingers over his neatly arranged shaving kit. "Even as a child, everything had its place." Gray was examining the desk, carefully sorting through papers. "Elizabeth," he called, "look at this." He held up several documents, land claims with notes written in the margins, maps with certain properties circled, a list of names with amounts beside them. "He was documenting the fraud," Elizabeth said, examining the papers. "Properties being sold multiple times, homesteaders being forced out." "And this," Gray said grimly, pointing to a name that appeared repeatedly. "Maxwell Thornton." "Who is he?" "Railroad man. Owns half the businesses in town, from what I've heard. The type who'd have much to gain from land grabs ahead of the railroad expansion." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she gathered the papers. "Do you think he had Samuel killed?" Gray's expression was grim. "Let's talk to the sheriff first, see what kind of investigation was really done." Sheriff Caldwell's office was at the far end of the main street. The man himself was heavyset with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much. He listened impassively as Elizabeth explained who she was and why she had come to Fargo. "Sorry for your loss, madam," he said when she finished, "but the case is closed. Your brother was shot during a robbery at his office. Nothing complicated about it." "Were there witnesses?" Gray asked. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "And you are Kyle Grayson. I escorted Miss Blackwell from the Southern Territory." "Well, Mr. Grayson, this isn't your concern." "But no, there weren't witnesses. Happened at night." "Was anything stolen?" Elizabeth pressed. Caldwell shrugged. "Some cash, some papers, possibly. Office was ransacked." "What about investigation into his work? He was documenting land fraud involving prominent citizens." The sheriff's expression hardened. "Miss Blackwell, your brother was making accusations he couldn't prove against respected businessmen, made himself unpopular, but that doesn't mean he was murdered for it." "I'd like to see where it happened," Elizabeth said. Caldwell sighed. "The land office already showed you where he was killed. His personal office." The sheriff hesitated, then stood. "Fine, I'll take you there, but then I expect this matter to be put to rest." Samuel's office was in a small building off a side street. Yellow stains still marked the floorboards where his blood had spilled. Elizabeth steeled herself against the wave of grief that threatened to overwhelm her. Gray moved silently through the space, examining the broken lock on the door, the scattered papers, the overturned furniture. "Strange robbery," he commented. "Most thieves grab what they can and run. This looks like someone was searching for something specific," the sheriff scowled, "or making it look like a robbery." "Exactly," Elizabeth said, "which means it means nothing conclusive," Caldwell interrupted. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual crimes to attend to." After the sheriff left, Gray and Elizabeth continued examining the office. Behind an overturned bookcase, Gray discovered a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a metal box locked. "Samuel was clever," Elizabeth said, a sad smile touching her lips. "He would have hidden what was important. Do you know where he might have kept a key?" Elizabeth thought for a moment, then reached for the watch chain she wore at her waist, a family heirloom that had been their father's. From it dangled a small key. "Samuel had one identical to this. We used to hide messages in matching boxes as children." The key fit perfectly. Inside the box were more documents and a letter addressed to Elizabeth. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it. "Dearest Lizzie," she read aloud, "if you're reading this, I fear the worst has happened. The corruption runs deeper than I initially believed. Maxwell Thornton isn't just buying land illegally, he's using the sheriff and judge to intimidate homesteaders, forge documents, even drive people from their rightful claims. I've compiled evidence implicating all of them, including receipts for bribes and falsified deeds. It's dangerous knowledge, which is why I've hidden copies with Reverend Miller at the church. He can be trusted, be careful, sister. These men are powerful and ruthless. All my love, Samuel." Elizabeth looked up at Gray, her eyes bright with tears and determination. He knew they might come for him. Gray nodded grimly. "And now we know why." He gathered the documents from the box. "We need to get these somewhere safe, then find the Reverend." As they left Samuel's office, Elizabeth noticed a man watching them from across the street, a well-dressed gentleman with cold eyes. When he saw her looking, he touched the brim of his hat in mock salute. "That's him," Gray muttered. "Maxwell Thornton." Thornton crossed the street toward them, his expensive boots barely touching the mud. "Miss Blackwell, I presume?" "Allow me to express my condolences on your brother's tragic passing." His voice was cultured, his smile never reaching his eyes. Elizabeth felt Gray tense beside her. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I understand you were acquainted with my brother." "Only professionally. The land office and my business interests occasionally intersected." His gaze flicked to the documents in Gray's hand. "I see you're collecting his personal effects. How thorough of you." "Just trying to understand what happened to him," Elizabeth said. Thornton's smile thinned. "A random act of violence, tragic but not uncommon in these frontier towns. Fargo is still evolving toward civilization." "Some might say the same about its businessmen," Gray commented. Thornton's eyes hardened as they turned to Gray. "I don't believe we've been introduced, sir." Kyle Grayson. "Ah, a drifter. How fortunate for Miss Blackwell to have found an escort in her time of grief." Thornton turned back to Elizabeth. "My dear, if there's anything you need during your stay in Fargo, please don't hesitate to call upon me. I have considerable influence in this town." "I'm sure you do," Elizabeth replied coldly. Thornton's smile disappeared entirely. "A word of advice, Miss Blackwell. Frontier towns can be dangerous for those who disturb settled matters. Your brother unfortunately never learned that lesson." He tipped his hat. "Good day." As he walked away, Elizabeth released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "He knows we have the documents." Gray nodded, his expression grim. "And he just threatened you directly." He took her elbow, guiding her quickly down the street. "We need to find that Reverend, and you need to stay out of sight." The church was at the edge of town, a simple white building with a modest steeple. Inside, they found Reverend Miller arranging hymnals in the pews. He was an older man with kind eyes that widened in recognition when Elizabeth introduced herself. "Miss Blackwell," he said, glancing nervously around the empty church. "I've been hoping you would come. Samuel told me to expect you." "He left something with you," Elizabeth said. "Documents." The Reverend nodded. "Not here. Come to the parsonage." In the small house behind the church, Miller retrieved a package from beneath a floorboard similar to the one in Samuel's office. "Your brother was thorough," he explained, handing it to Elizabeth. "He gave me this the day before he died, said it contained evidence of corruption that reached to the highest levels of the town." "Did he seem afraid?" Elizabeth asked, concerned certainly, but resolved. Miller hesitated. "Miss Blackwell, these men he was investigating, they're powerful, dangerous. The sheriff, Judge Harmon Thornton, they control this town." "We've met Thornton," Gray said grimly. "He made it clear Elizabeth's in danger." Miller nodded. "You need to leave Fargo. Take the evidence to the federal marshal in Bismarck. He's beyond local influence." "I can't leave," Elizabeth protested. "Not until Samuel has justice." "You can't get him justice if you're dead," Gray said bluntly. "These men won't hesitate to kill you too." Elizabeth knew he was right, but the thought of leaving without resolution felt like abandoning her brother all over again. "I want to visit his grave first," she said. "I need to say goodbye." Gray and the Reverend exchanged looks. "I'll take you at dusk," Miller said, fewer eyes watching then. They spent the afternoon reviewing the evidence Samuel had gathered. It was damning records of bribes, falsified deeds, even orders for hired men to intimidate homesteaders. Samuel had meticulously documented a conspiracy that had stolen thousands of acres from rightful owners, all to benefit Thornton's railroad interests. As the sun began to set, Reverend Miller led them to the cemetery at the edge of town. Samuel's grave was marked with a simple wooden cross, the earth still fresh. Elizabeth knelt beside it, tears flowing freely as she placed wildflowers on the mound. "I'm sorry I was too late," she whispered, "but I promise you they'll answer for what they've done." Gray stood a respectful distance away, keeping watch. As Elizabeth finished her prayers, he suddenly tensed. "Someone's coming," he warned, hand moving to his gun. Through the gathering dusk, they saw 3 men approaching on horseback, Sheriff Caldwell and 2 deputies. The Reverend stepped forward as they dismounted. "Sheriff, what brings you here at this hour?" Caldwell's face was grim. "Got word that you're harboring fugitives, Reverend." "Fugitives?" Elizabeth stood, brushing dirt from her skirts. "We've broken no laws." "Theft and conspiracy," the sheriff replied. "Mr. Thornton has reported sensitive business documents stolen from the land office, says you took them this afternoon." Gray moved to stand beside Elizabeth. "Those documents belong to Samuel Blackwell. They're his sister's rightful property." "That's for a judge to decide." Caldwell gestured to his deputies. "Hand over the papers and Miss Blackwell can stay free while this is sorted out." "And if we refuse?" Gray asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The sheriff's hand rested on his gun. "Don't make this difficult, Grayson." Elizabeth touched Gray's arm. "We need to find another way," she murmured. Then, louder, "The papers aren't with us, Sheriff. They're already on their way to the federal marshal in Bismarck." Caldwell's face darkened. "You're lying." "Search us if you don't believe me," she challenged. The sheriff nodded to his deputies, who roughly searched Gray and checked Elizabeth's small handbag. They found nothing. "See," Elizabeth said calmly. "By this time tomorrow, the marshal will have everything he needs to investigate Thornton, you, Judge Harmon, and everyone else involved." "You've made a serious mistake," Caldwell growled. "Thornton won't stand for this." "Neither will the federal government," Reverend Miller interjected. "Interfering with a federal investigation carries serious penalties, Sheriff." Caldwell hesitated, clearly unsure whether Elizabeth was bluffing. Finally, he spat on the ground. "This isn't over. You'd best be gone from Fargo by morning, Miss Blackwell." After they left, Gray turned to Elizabeth with reluctant admiration. "Quick thinking. But now we actually need to get those documents to Bismarck before they realize we still have them." "We'll leave tonight," she decided, "as soon as it's fully dark." Reverend Miller offered them fresh horses and provisions. "Take the North Road," he advised. "Less traveled. You can reach Bismarck in 2 days if you ride hard." As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth took one last look at Samuel's grave, silently renewing her promise. Gray watched her, his expression softening. "He'd be proud of you," he said quietly. Elizabeth smiled through her tears. "I hope so." She mounted her horse. "Let's finish what he started." They rode through the night, keeping off the main trails. Gray led them across open prairie, navigating by the stars with the skill of a man who had spent years in the wilderness. By dawn, they had put considerable distance between themselves and Fargo, but Gray remained vigilant. "They'll have sent riders after us," he said as they paused to rest the horses. "Thornton has too much to lose to let us reach Bismarck." Elizabeth nodded, fatigue and grief etched on her face. "How much further?" "Another day and a half at least." Gray studied her with concern. "You should rest." "I'll keep watch," she shook her head. "We need to keep moving." They continued their journey through the day, skirting small settlements, keeping to less traveled paths. By late afternoon, Gray's prediction proved true in the distance. They spotted riders following their trail. "There," he pointed to a line of trees along a ridge. "We can lose them in that forest." They spurred their tired horses toward the trees, but the pursuers were gaining. As they reached the edge of the forest, a shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark near Elizabeth's head. Gray pulled his rifle from its scabbard and returned fire, forcing their pursuers to scatter for cover. "Into the trees," he shouted, and they plunged into the forest. The dense woods offered protection but slowed their progress. Gray led them along a barely visible game trail, constantly checking behind them. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but he knew their hunters wouldn't give up easily. As dusk approached, they came to a swift-flowing river cutting through the forest. "We need to cross," Gray said, eyeing the churning water. "It will cover our tracks." The river was high from recent rains, the current dangerous. Gray found a section where it narrowed slightly, the water running shallow over a rocky bed. "Stay close behind me," he instructed. "If you fall, drop the reins and swim for the opposite bank. Don't fight the current." They urged their reluctant horses into the water. The animals struggled against the current, hooves slipping on smooth stones. Halfway across, Elizabeth's horse stumbled, nearly throwing her. Gray reached back, steadying her with a strong hand. "Almost there," he encouraged. They reached the far bank, the horses scrambling up the muddy slope. Just as they gained solid ground, shouts echoed from the trees behind them. Their pursuers had reached the river. "Keep going," Gray urged. "Don't stop." They rode deeper into the forest as darkness fell, making pursuit nearly impossible. Finally, when the horses could go no further, they made camp in a small clearing, not daring to light a fire. "Get some sleep," Gray said, checking his weapons. "I'll take first watch." Elizabeth was too exhausted to argue. She wrapped herself in a blanket and lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. After a while, she sat up to find Gray leaning against a tree, his silhouette outlined by moonlight filtering through the branches. "You should be sleeping," he said without turning. "I keep seeing Samuel," she admitted, wondering if he died afraid, alone. Gray was silent for a long moment. "Your brother died standing for what was right. That's not a bad way to go." Elizabeth moved to sit beside him. "Is that how you'd want to go?" He glanced at her, then back to the darkness. "Better than most ways." "What happened today?" she began. "We got away," he interrupted. "That's what matters." "No," Elizabeth said firmly. "What matters is that you're risking your life for me, for Samuel's cause." "Why?" Gray shifted uncomfortably. "You needed help. There's more to it than that." She turned to face him fully. "You could have left me in Fargo, pointed me toward Bismarck, and ridden away. No one would have blamed you." The moonlight cast shadows across his features, making him impossible to read. "Maybe I've spent too long riding away," he finally said, his voice low. Elizabeth's heart quickened. Gray, a twig snapped in the darkness, instantly silencing their conversation. Gray was on his feet in an instant, gun drawn. He motioned for Elizabeth to stay down as he moved silently toward the sound. Minutes passed in tense silence. Elizabeth clutched Samuel's documents to her chest, ready to run if necessary. Finally, Gray returned, holstering his weapon. "Just a deer," he reported. "But we should move on at first light. We're still too close to the river." Elizabeth nodded, relief washing over her. As she settled back under her blanket, Gray surprised her by sitting close beside her. "To answer your question," he said quietly, "I'm helping because it's the right thing to do. Because your brother deserves justice." He paused. "And because I've come to care what happens to you, Elizabeth Blackwell." Before she could respond, he continued. "Now get some sleep. Tomorrow will be a hard ride." Morning brought gray skies and a light drizzle. They ate a cold breakfast and continued their journey, the horses moving slowly through muddy terrain. The forest eventually gave way to rolling prairie, making them more visible but allowing faster travel. "We'll reach the outskirts of Bismarck by nightfall if we keep this pace," Gray said, scanning the horizon for pursuers. As they crested a hill, Elizabeth gasped. In the valley below, a group of riders waited, at least 6 men, including Sheriff Caldwell and a figure she recognized as Maxwell Thornton. "They cut across country while we went through the forest," Gray muttered. "Damn it." "What do we do?" Elizabeth asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. Gray studied the valley, considering their options. "There's no way around without adding days to our journey. Then we go through." He looked at her in surprise. "That's 7 armed men down there." Elizabeth straightened in her saddle. "We have the documents. If we can get past them, we win." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm not turning back, Gray." A slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "I'm beginning to think Boston didn't deserve you," he said. Then, more seriously, "We'll need a distraction." They formulated a plan. Gray would circle around to approach from the east, drawing their attention with gunfire. Meanwhile, Elizabeth would take the documents and make a run for Bismarck, using the confusion to slip past the blockade. "Once you're clear, don't stop for anything," Gray instructed, transferring extra ammunition to her saddlebags. "The marshal's office is on the main street. You can't miss it." Elizabeth nodded, trying to ignore the fear clawing at her throat. "What about you? How will you escape?" "Don't worry about me," he said, checking his rifle. "I've gotten out of worse." "Gray," she said, suddenly seized by the possibility that she might never see him again. He leaned across the space between their horses and kissed her, brief but fierce. "Tell me later," he said as he pulled away, his eyes holding a promise. "When this is over." Before she could respond, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, circling toward the eastern ridge. Elizabeth watched until he disappeared, then readied herself, securing the precious documents inside her jacket. Minutes later, gunshots echoed from the eastern slope. Elizabeth saw the men below turning, pointing, several of them spurring their horses toward the sound. This was her chance. She urged her horse forward, racing down the western slope toward the road to Bismarck. She was halfway across the valley when a shout went up. 2 riders had spotted her and were giving chase. Elizabeth leaned low over her horse's neck, pushing the animal to its limits. The road stretched before her, Bismarck still miles away. Behind her, the sounds of gunfire intensified. She risked a glance back to see Gray engaged in a firefight with several men, including Thornton himself. The sight of him, outnumbered but fighting, made her heart constrict. One of her pursuers was gaining. Elizabeth heard the whistle of a bullet past her ear and instinctively ducked lower. Her horse, sensing her fear, found new strength, pulling ahead. The second pursuer fell back, but the first she recognized, Sheriff Caldwell, continued the chase. The miles blurred together. Her horse was lathered with sweat, breathing heavily. Caldwell remained doggedly on her trail. As they approached a bend in the road, Elizabeth made a split-second decision. Instead of following the curve, she cut directly across country, jumping a low stone wall and racing across open fields. Caldwell followed, but his heavier horse struggled with the rough terrain. Elizabeth gained ground, eventually losing sight of him behind a rise. Ahead, she could see the outskirts of Bismarck buildings rising against the darkening sky. She reached the town as dusk was falling, her horse nearly spent. People stared as she galloped down the main street, her hair wild, clothes mud-splattered. She reined in before a brick building with a federal marshal's star on the door and practically fell from her saddle. Inside, she found Marshal James Harker, a stern-faced man with iron gray hair. She thrust the documents into his hands, words tumbling out as she explained who she was, what the papers contained, and the conspiracy in Fargo that had cost her brother his life. Harker listened intently, examining the evidence as she spoke. "These are serious accusations, Miss Blackwell," he said when she finished. "But Samuel's documentation is thorough. Thornton and his conspirators won't escape justice." "They're coming," Elizabeth said desperately. Sheriff Caldwell was right behind me, and Gray, she faltered. My friend is still out there fighting them. Harker immediately called for his deputies. We'll send men to intercept them. Your friend's name? Kyle Grayson. While Harker organized a response force, Elizabeth paced the office, worry for Gray consuming her. What if he'd been shot, captured? The thought of him dying to protect her was unbearable. Hours passed with no word. Marshal Harker placed her under protection at the town's hotel, but she couldn't rest. From her window, she watched the road leading into town, praying for a glimpse of a familiar figure. Near midnight, commotion in the street drew her attention. Riders were coming in the marshal's men, escorting prisoners. She rushed downstairs to find Sheriff Caldwell and 3 others in custody, Maxwell Thornton among them, but no sign of Gray. "Marshal," she called, approaching Harker. "My friend," Harker's expression was grave. "No sign of him, Miss Blackwell. There was evidence of a significant firefight about 5 miles out, blood on the ground." Elizabeth's legs nearly gave way. "He can't be. We'll send men to search at first light," Harker promised. But given what these men were willing to do, she returned to her room, numb with grief and exhaustion. She had accomplished what she'd set out to do. Samuel's killers would face justice, the corruption exposed. But the victory felt hollow without Gray. Elizabeth stood at the window, watching as the moon rose over Bismarck. Somewhere out there, Gray might be lying wounded or worse. The thought was unbearable. "You look like you're planning to steal a horse and go searching yourself." The voice from the doorway made her whirl around. Gray stood there, leaning heavily against the frame, his shirt blood-stained, a rough bandage around his left arm, but alive. Wonderfully, impossibly alive. "Gray," she breathed, rushing to him. Her hands hovered over his injuries, afraid to touch him. "You're hurt." "Not as bad as it looks," he said, his eyes never leaving her face. "Thornton's men were lousy shots. The marshal said there was blood, most of it wasn't mine." His expression grew serious. "Did you reach Harker? Are the documents safe?" Elizabeth nodded, tears of relief filling her eyes. "Yes, Thornton and the sheriff are in custody. It's over." Gray swayed slightly and she quickly helped him to a chair. "You need a doctor." "Already saw one on the edge of town, just a flesh wound." He captured her hand in his. "You did it, Elizabeth. Your brother would be proud." "We did it," she corrected, kneeling beside his chair. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Gray's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "What will you do now? Return to Boston?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Elizabeth looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability beneath his strength. "I don't think Boston is home anymore," she said softly. "Not after everything that's happened." Hope flickered across his face. "And where is home?" Elizabeth's hand moved to his cheek, feeling the rough stubble beneath her fingers. "I'm beginning to think home isn't a place at all." Gray turned his face to press a kiss into her palm. "I've been running for a long time," he said, his voice low. "Never staying anywhere, never letting myself care too much. And now I'm thinking maybe it's time to stop running." His eyes held hers. "If I had someone worth staying for." Elizabeth's heart swelled. "I believe you do, Mr. Grayson." He pulled her gently to him, mindful of his injuries, and kissed her, not the desperate kiss of earlier, but a tender promise of what could be. When they parted, Elizabeth rested her forehead against his. "So what happens next?" she whispered. Gray smiled, a full smile that transformed his face. "First I heal up, then we see justice done for Samuel." His hand cupped her cheek. "After that, I hear the Montana Territory has good land for ranching, beautiful country." "Is that an invitation, Cowboy?" "It's a future, Elizabeth, if you want it." She answered him with another kiss, knowing in her heart that while she had lost a brother, she had found a love worth building a life around, a love born in danger, but promising a future neither of them had dared to imagine. 2 months later, Elizabeth stood on the porch of a modest ranch house, watching as Gray worked with a young colt in the corral. The Montana Territory had proven everything he'd promised: wild, beautiful, and full of possibility. With the money from the sale of Samuel's property and their reward from the federal government for exposing the land fraud ring, they had purchased this small ranch 20 miles from Helena. Justice had been served in Fargo. Maxwell Thornton and his conspirators faced federal charges for fraud, corruption, and Samuel's murder. Elizabeth had testified at their preliminary hearing, finally able to tell her brother's story and see his killers brought to account. The ranch was coming along well. The main house was simple but comfortable, with room to grow. Gray had hired 2 hands to help with the stock, and Elizabeth had planted a garden that was already flourishing in the summer sun. They had decided to name the place Redemption Ranch, a fresh start for both of them. Gray finished with the colt and walked toward the house, removing his hat as he climbed the steps. Even after 2 months of marriage, Elizabeth's heart still quickened at the sight of him. "That colt's going to be a fine horse," he said, placing his hat on the porch rail and drawing her into his arms. "Stubborn but good-hearted, reminds me of someone I know." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "I hope that's a compliment, Mr. Grayson." "The highest," he assured her, kissing her lightly. "Letter came while you were out with the horses." He nodded toward the table where an envelope lay. "From Marshal Harker." Elizabeth opened it, scanning the contents quickly. "They've been convicted," she announced, "Thornton and the others. 20 years in federal prison." She looked up, emotions washing over her. "Samuel has justice." Gray squeezed her hand. "You gave him that. We gave him that," she corrected, leaning into his embrace. "I never could have done it alone." As the sun began to set over the mountains, casting golden light across their land, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that first desperate meeting during an ambush, to the moment Gray had pulled her from the quicksand and into his arms, to the dangerous chase that had ultimately led to justice and love, every step had been necessary to reach this place of peace. "What are you thinking about?" Gray asked, his arm warm around her waist. Elizabeth smiled up at him. "About quicksand. How sometimes what looks like solid ground can pull you under. And sometimes," he added, understanding immediately, "what looks like the end is actually the beginning." "Exactly." She rested her head against his shoulder. "When I set out to find Samuel, I never imagined finding you instead." Gray kissed the top of her head. "Life has a way of giving you what you need, even when it's not what you were looking for." As darkness settled over Redemption Ranch, Elizabeth knew that while the past could never be changed, the future stretched before them full of promise. From tragedy had come triumph, from loss had come love, and from the treacherous quicksand of grief had come the solid ground of a new beginning. In the years that followed, Redemption Ranch prospered under their care. They added to the house as their family grew, first with the arrival of their son Samuel Kyle in 1878, followed by twin daughters Sarah and Catherine 2 years later. Gray proved to be a natural father, passing on his knowledge of horses and the land, while Elizabeth established a small school for their children and those of neighboring ranchers. They never forgot what had brought them together. Each year on the anniversary of Samuel's death, they would ride to a hilltop overlooking their land and remember the brother whose quest for justice had ultimately led to their happiness. And each year, Gray would remind Elizabeth of the moment he'd pulled her from the quicksand, the moment they both agreed when they had begun falling in love, though neither had recognized it at the time. "It was your courage," Gray would say, his once weathered face now softened by years of happiness. "Standing there covered in mud, more concerned about your horse than yourself." "And it was your strength," Elizabeth would reply, touching his face with a hand that had grown skilled with both a pen and a lasso. "Not just in your arms, but in your heart." Their love story became something of a legend in the territory, how a Boston schoolteacher seeking justice for her murdered brother had found herself sinking in quicksand, only to be rescued by a lone cowboy who had spent years running from his past. How together they had exposed corruption, found healing, and built something beautiful from the ashes of loss. And on quiet evenings, watching their children play in the yard of the home they had built together, Elizabeth and Gray would sometimes exchange a look that said more than words ever could, a look that acknowledged all they had overcome and all they had found in each other. A love as vast as the Montana sky, as enduring as the mountains on the horizon, and as real as the solid ground beneath their feet.